Yes, Mr. Bragg.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, Sir Brian, I'd just like to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this inquiry. It's very important to me, and I hope that I can add to the learning and to the recommendations that come out of it. And also thank you to the team who supported me all the way through this and been very helpful, and I appreciate that. So what I'm going to do today is just basically talk around my recommendations to the inquiry. I've made 3. In my submission in November, they were very short and succinct. And what I want to do is just add a bit more flash around that to actually say, well, why have I arrived at those conclusions? So I'm going to work through a repeat of my background for those of you here when we're talking about the Skipton Fund. It'll be a refresh on my experience at Hep C, a bit about my profession, what I do for a living, and then how my professional expertise has come into play every time I've been interacting with the health service, and then how that has shaped the recommendations, and I'll run through the recommendations. So starting with Hep C, I had a road traffic accident in Norway on 18th of August 1986. I rode into a tunnel on a motorbike and it had no lights in it. It turned right, so I went straight into the wall. So I was treated in hospital in Bergen. Excellent. They saved my life, probably. They definitely saved my leg. I discharged from Bergen, got flown home, went into the hospital in Liverpool for a couple of days, and then I was in the outpatient care for Liverpool until January 87. I had 2 operations there, one to take pins out of my feet to hold my foot and ankle together, and then screws out of my shin. I had a nail, metal nail about that long, went from my knee to my ankle, which held my right leg together. In February 87, I started work again in Lancashire, so I moved to Blackburn Infirmary. In October of 87, they decided to take this nail out of my leg, and that was a major operation. And I definitely am aware that I had blood transfusion after that, because I remember waking up with antibiotics with blood and a 3rd bag. I didn't know what it was. I was diagnosed with hepatitis C in 1999. I worked for ICI. I've been working with ICI India on a project there, and I got ill. And when I came home, I didn't feel well at all for a long time. ICI had an occupational health team, so those doctors really wanted to know what it had in India. So they kept looking and looking and looking. Eventually said, we can't find anything which might be attributable to what you had in India, so we're widening the scope. The next thing they said was, you've got a problem with your liver. And a few weeks later, they said, you've got hepatitis C, here's a letter, go and talk to your doctor. So at that point, I came under the care of the regional liver unit in Newcastle. They confirmed the diagnosis. They informed me that I wouldn't receive any treatment because it was too expensive. And so for the next couple of years, I just went every quarter to be told that I still had hepatitis and nothing was happening. Eventually, in 2001, Professor Bassendine in Newcastle rang me up and said, there's a clinical trial for some new drugs for the NHS. Are you prepared to go on this trial? I said yes. So a bit later that year, I started interferon ribavirin therapy. That was 48 weeks of probably hell is probably the best way of describing it. But at the end of that, I'd cleared. I didn't have Hep C anymore. So 3 negative PCRs and I was discharged. However, I did have an awful lot of ongoing issues as a result of having a Hep C. So I had liver fibrosis, I had non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. My liver function tests were still typically over 3 times the normal max. So I'd run about 130. So obviously there was still inflammation going on. My heart rate was between 110 and 120 sometimes, and my blood pressure was very concerning for the doctor. So I've been on medication for that since 2002. The interferon really scrambles your immune system. And what my expectation was I'd get through the interferon and it would return to normal. it didn't. So I am still very vulnerable to infections. So I get infections every year. And every other year or every third year, I get very severe infections. So I've had sepsis 3 times, so I've been hospitalised with pneumonia. My last one was 2019, where I got what was called ESBL, which is doesn't respond to antibiotics. So I was very ill, and the message I got through my GP was that the hospital would not admit me unless it was critical, because they'd have to create a special isolation area for me. So I did manage to get through it, thankfully, but you do live in reservation about what the next infection is going to do to you. I also developed type 2 diabetes in 2017, and that's probably liver related, because when I started taking the medication, my liver function results declined. So I'm only 2 times the max now. So there's a number of things. That means that over my time in the last 20 odd years, I've had a lot of contact with the health service. Now, my professional background is I'm a chemical engineer. I'm also a chartered scientist. So I started work in the chemical industry in 1976. So I've spent all my working life working in the chemical industry, which is all about high hazard chemicals. These are things which could seriously impact both our employees, our neighbours, and people who use it. So we're very, very focused on managing safety, on understanding risk, and taking those actions to make sure that we control those risks such that we don't impact on people. And sort of through my background, because I started as a chemist, and then between 82 and 86 I did a chemical engineering degree. I've worked with regulation all my life, understanding regulation, implementing regulations. I've worked in manufacturing, I've worked in research, technology management, business development, and currently, since 2008, I've been looking after sustainability for the company. So my official job title these days is Global Sustainability and Regulation Manager. I work for what was ICI and is now part of a big Japanese company. So in my working life, I deal with regulation. And I have to understand the implications of regulation and understand how regulation can be managed within the company. How do we deal with it? How do we make sure we deliver against it? Alongside all these roles, I'm also being a lead auditor. So I audit our operations globally for safety, for manufacturing effectiveness, for project effectiveness, so understanding organisational systems. So I'm quite experienced in actually visiting somewhere, it might be a couple of days or a week or so, but going in and understanding how well that organisation is functioning. So every time I've been with the NHS, I have been a professional observer of organisational systems. So I've been looking at how the medical teams who are treating me are functioning. And it's not always a very pretty picture. So there are lots of examples of where poor team working, poor communication, unsystematic working from memory. So lots of boxes which in my business we wouldn't accept, but seems to be fairly routine in the health service. And the type of things I'm looking for is not really specific to my industry. There are lots of industries where you face complex challenges which potentially put lives at risk. So the chemical industry, oil and gas industry, offshore, nuclear industry, aviation, building complex structures. In all of these, managing risk, managing personal safety, managing the safety of third parties is absolutely the core of what you do. But I see very little of that thinking in the NHS. So how do we end up so good at this and perhaps NHS not so good? Well, we have external regulatory drivers that keep us honest. So in the UK, we have the Health and Safety Executive. So they're responsible for managing safety for all businesses, operations in the UK. So if we have an incident or an accident which results in serious harm or death, we will be externally audited in a very rigorous way. And all our failings will be exposed, and we will be expected to put it right and make sure it never happens again. We also have external inquiries, and like this one. So, for example, when Piper Alpha happened, 185 people died. And the learning for us was really significant from that inquiry, because we weren't getting it right. There was real opportunities for it to do things in a far more professional way. And so not just the oil and gas offshore industry, but the chemical industry had a real big stand back, and we really revisited how we managed the personal safety of everybody our operations impacted on. So inquiries like this can actually be a very significant vehicle to drive change, to drive improvement. If you think of the aviation industry, nobody gets on an aeroplane and expects the crew to ad hoc, wing it, essentially. They expect the crew to work together, to use checklists, to make sure that they're doing everything that they need to, that they're highly trained. So if something does go wrong, they know what to do. We expect that. And yet, those practices, those ways of working, I don't see very much of in the NHS. So that concerns me. So what have I seen when I look at the NHS? Well, number one is that it's a firefighting organisation. So that's the typical type of working is they're presented with a problem. You've got a patient. You deal with it. The patient moves on. You forget about it. There's no learning. There's no improvement. You've just got a series of patients that walk past you, and you deal with it, and then you walk away. Now, that's actually very common in most organisations, but it's very uncommon in highly effective organisations. Highly effective organisations don't work in that way. You have very systemised approaches. You understand where the risks are. You put in practice the processes and procedures to do things safely, to do things consistently. You audit. If you have an incident, you investigate it, you report it, you learn from it, and you apply that learning. That's how you get to be good. If you don't do that, you're not good. So I see in the NHS an organisation which is crying out to actually drive towards being a better organisation, a more highly effective organisation, a less dysfunctional organisation is at the moment. But there doesn't seem to be any ambition to do that. So some opportunities I've noted as a patient, very unsystematic. So doctors particularly work from memory. So, if you think of a pilot, you don't expect a pilot to remember how to fly an airplane and all the checks that you need to do because you learned it at flight school. 10, 15 years on, you need something which reminds people how to do things. We call it standard operational procedures. You actually put down in a one-size page, these are all the key things you need to get right, and these are things you need to check before you do something. They're called checklists. Checklists are very common. The aviation industry has them all over the place. I don't see it. I just really don't see it. You need team working. You need teams to come together, cross-functional teams. The NHS is a classic where you've got lots of different functions. You've got lots of different types of doctors. You've got different types of nurses. You've got administrators. It's a very technical world these days. More and more complex machinery is required to support treatment. But it's also an organisation that has a lot of individuals in it that don't really work together. They gather in groups, but they don't bond as a team. And even more so, they tend not to communicate very well. I've sat there and watched big gaps in communication where people either have not done things or not done things, and certainly haven't communicated it around the rest of the team. So mistakes have been made. You have to think about it and work on it. They certainly don't measure, and they certainly don't measure what goes wrong. So there's no overview of how well they're doing. And I don't see any real systematic approach to learning from mistakes. Trying to pick up on what you could do better next time, and then introduce it in your team, and then try and spread that out across other teams. And we've got hospitals all over the world. They're all going through this, and they should be pretty good at it by now, but actually don't seem to be. So, as an overview, my view on the NHS is it's not a learning organisation. It's a firefighting organisation, just lives day to day. It needs more systematic and standardised approaches to reduce that potential for making errors and mistakes. And they need much better teamwork and communication. They need to work at it. They need to recognise the value of team working. Now, I would recommend that if you get the opportunity, if you read this book, it's very enlightening. It's called The Checklist, and it's written by a guy called Atul Gawande, who's a doctor in America, he's a surgeon. He was intrigued by checklists. They didn't use them in his hospital, but he was intrigued by it. So he took the time out to go into the aviation industry, go into construction industry, and saw how they used it. And he thought there was some potential. The World Health Organization then approached him and asked him to be part of a team that looked at what would the impact of checklists in surgery across a range of hospitals globally. So it was a project run by the WHO, and he was involved in setting up the checklists and the process to monitor performance before the checklists and the performance after. And the experience was from that the rate of error, the rate of failure was relatively high. They were looking at perhaps 30% error rate in the operations they monitored in the 2 months before they started the study. After introducing checklists, they halved it, less than 15%. And that was just in a relatively short period of time. So they were enthused. One of the hospitals in the UK, now that was in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, and you won't see that much in hospitals. Very successful, lots of opportunity, no learning, no implementation. So if you get an opportunity, read this book. I'll reference for the inquiry team, but it's well worth, because it's quite revealing in terms of the thinking that doctors have about how they manage what they do professionally, and the impact that checklists might have on actually making things better. So, good book, recommend it. A couple of observations about the NHS, and this is more general rather than my specific, I've experienced this, but the NHS culture towards openness and reporting professionally appalls me. The fact that the NHS can suppress whistleblowing, that they can bully, intimidate whistleblowing, that they can legally hamstring people to prevent them expressing their concerns is extremely unprofessional. Extremely unprofessional. We encourage our staff to be open, to report to us, to tell us when things are going wrong, because they're the people who see it happening. The culture you create by doing this stops it. Now, it's not just at local level. It's in the press, so everybody knows about it. So this is being approved effectively from the top down. And a bit like the old saying that the fish rots from the head. So for me, we need to put a stop to this. We need to make sure that anybody has a concern in the NHS, they feel they can express it. If somebody's doing something which is malicious, then all the disciplining measure in the world already exists to deal with that. So what you're suppressing is people who have concerns about what they're doing in their profession. So we need to make that more open. We need to make sure that organisations cannot close down that type of thing. The other thing is about responsibility for outcomes. There have been lots and lots of inquiries into things that have gone wrong in the NHS. And what do we hear? Well, we always hear there's an apology. We're very sorry. We promise we'll never do it again. And yet there's no learning, there's no implementation, and you can guarantee there is every opportunity that they will do it again because they haven't actually addressed the issues that were identified. So organisations need to take responsibility. Things do go wrong. It's inevitable. But you have to own it, you have to recognise it, and you have to deal with it. And right now, the NHS is not in a safe space in terms of that aspect of its organisation. It needs responsibility. It needs to accept and deal with when things go wrong. I've got a sample example of something which doesn't relate to this inquiry, but it's something which triggered something in me. There was a lady called Louise Dempster who was part of the East Kent Hospital Trust inquiry. Now, she gave birth in May 2015, and the labour went wrong, and she had to have a caesarean. Her son was born large and healthy, but she had a massive hemorrhage afterwards. And probably, if her mother, who was a trained nurse, hadn't been there, she'd have probably died. Now, the surgeon told her that the bleeding was because it was due to the size of her son. For 7 years, the hospital trust maintained that it was her baby that was responsible for her hemorrhage. She gave evidence to the Kirkup inquiry, and in that inquiry, the chairman called her and said he discovered a document which had not been disclosed to the family. And in it, it was evident that the hospital knew it was a result of surgical error, and for 7 years had lied to her. So the report found that the staff had omitted key details in accounts given to families and effectively covering up the truth. So to me, that's a good example of responsibility. Something went wrong. You have to own up to that. You don't cover it up, you own up to it. So as a background, this has led me to sort of think about, well, what have I learned? What would I recommend to this inquiry? And so my recommendations have been shaped by that thinking and my experiences and my observations. I'd make one comment is that my first two recommendations are both generic because they relate to a much wider problem in the NHS, but they are also specific to this inquiry. Because my belief is if my first two recommendations had been implemented early enough on, we would not be here today. This inquiry would not need to be constituted because the problem wouldn't have existed. So, yes, they're very generic in terms of this is a problem which is NHS-wide, but it's also specific to this inquiry in terms of it relates to why we're here today and why did it go wrong. So, Lawrence, slide number 1. So, my first recommendation is about creating a statutory responsibility for all employees in the NHS to form a report when serious injury or death has occurred, which might have been preventable. So something's gone wrong, there's been an error, there's been a mistake, there was an opportunity to do something, there's an opportunity to not do something, and as a result, an individual has received harm which was avoidable. Background to this is that, well, some of the things are talked about use of standardisations and checklists and all that. Well, there's a whole gamut of things that needs to happen to make the NHS better. I'm just focusing on one aspect, which is about reporting. Right now, there is very little reporting of what happens in the NHS. So there is no current accurate estimate of how many avoidable injuries of death occur at all within the NHS. No reporting at all. There's a paper from the London School of Tropical Medicine. They estimate that about 10% of patients suffer harm, and about 5% of deaths are avoidable. The fact that there's a couple of papers around which are roughly all in the same area, which suggests maybe 5% avoidable deaths. But the NHS itself has no records at all of how many incidents they had and how they are ranked. Is a huge gap in omission that needs to be corrected. It does not happen in my industry, it doesn't happen in other industries. So I believe that there is a real need to create a mandatory reporting, bottom up. So it's a responsibility of staff to record, to report when something goes wrong. I've got an interesting quote from Jeremy Hunt MP, who got talked about a little bit earlier on in the day. So, and this comes from something called the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch, which was formed in 2017. It will shortly become a slightly larger branch, but it's going to be charged with investigating things in the NHS. But in their one of their articles, Jeremy Hunt had attended a seminar that they ran. And this is a quote from the article, this is the 8th of June, 2022. So, Jeremy Hunt described arriving in office in 2012 when the mid-staffs inquiry was in progress. He told us at that time he knew very little about patient safety. He recalled being told that 10% of patients are harmed as a result of their care, and that is just how it was. He learned that of all deaths, 4% are potentially avoidable. That's 150 patients per week dying unnecessarily. That's the equivalent of an airliner falling out of the sky every fortnight, and yet it wasn't even spoken about. That is still the same today. That we're still in the same position today. He described the overwhelming feeling that this is just wrong, and he had to do something about it. So we're talking about 2012, and we're now in 2023, and nothing's really changed yet. Now, if we think of Boeing as an example, the 737 MAX, that Boeing lost 2 aeroplanes. So that's the equivalent of 1 month's deaths in the NHS, which are potentially avoidable. You know, potentially avoidable. It's very difficult to, without definitive information, it's difficult to quantify it. But what's happened to Boeing? Boeing's share price is halved. The sales of 737 MAXes was halted for almost 2 years. They've had to completely redesign the elements which were non-functional, weren't working well in that. And that's for a few hundred people when we're talking about thousands of people in the NHS. The driver to do something is very, very significant. We're blind to it because it's not measured and reported, and it's not reported openly. So my first proposal is very much about driving that reporting and putting that into an open, transparent arena so we all know about it. Yeah? If what happened to us in terms of Hep C and HIV had been reported as an error and a mistake, and it was in the public domain, and there had been investigations to try and... we wouldn't be here now. They would have dealt with this years ago. But they didn't do that. They didn't publish the numbers. They hid it. They obscured it. They destroyed the data. That's not an open and transparent organisation. Well, inherently, if the organisation is not open and transparent, which would appear the NHS isn't, then you have to create a statutory driver to make it happen, because they're not going to do it on their own volition. So my experience is that voluntary initiatives are actually very ineffective because most people don't follow it through. If you've got a reason why you can avoid doing something, you avoid it. Statutory requirements, regulatory requirements have to be followed so people do it. So very much we need a regulatory approach. It needs to be at local level. Observation of the NHS is there's lots and lots of different regulatory bodies, but they're all at very high level, high organisational levels. And whether or not their objectives actually filter all the way through to the ground level is a really moot point. If you require reporting of every incident, that reporting inevitably has to be at local level. So at local level, you drive transparency. You drive the ability to report without fear of anything going wrong or being victimised, that you investigate it, that the information is openly available. So you take responsibility that an error has occurred and we're going to do something about it because the numbers are out there. That will drive doing something. Now, it just so happens that actually is a regulation in the UK that will do that. It's called the Reporting of Injuries, Diseases and Dangerous Occurrence Regulations, which were last updated in 2013. It's called RIDDOR. Anybody in industry is very familiar with RIDDOR. That's what we report against. It's run by the Health and Safety Executive. If we have an injury which falls into the RIDDOR classifications, by law, we have to report it. Now, it just so happens, and this is the bit I didn't understand until I was looking into this, that RIDDOR actually applies to the health and social care sector as well. So there is an existing piece of legislation which should apply to the health service. Doing my admittedly limited sort of snapshot survey into doing this, I actually found some very effective RIDDOR reporting flowcharts in some hospital trusts for employees only. RIDDOR also applies to patients. We are a third party under the care of that organisation. So if we are adversely affected by something that happens in the hospital, such that it falls into the dangerous occurrence or death, it should be mandatory reporting. It isn't at the moment. So if we could drive RIDDOR reporting in hospitals in an effective way, then we'll start flushing out all these incidents, and it would have stopped us being here today, because this would have been open public domain information 30 years ago. So it's the type of thing which I would see from this inquiry as a really beneficial outcome. It's part of driving the change which needs to happen in turning it into a more responsible, more effective organisation. You have to care about patients. It would appear to me at the moment that it is an accepted fact of life in the health service that patients are harmed or die, and that's just the way it is. We've got to change that. We've got to break the cycle. And if doctors who have signed the Hippocratic Oath, which is do no harm, can actually accept that they are doing harm and just shrug the shoulder and walk on, you've got to break that perception. So regulation is the only way for me. So there's RIDDOR should actually solve that problem. My proposal one should be a relatively simple thing to implement, which is patient safety is RIDDOR reportable. And then the key thing is about how do you make sure that it is rigorously enforced? How do you make sure that at ground level, at ground roots level, it's not ignored, that it's taken seriously? So that's probably the difficult question in all this. How do you make your medical teams comply with RIDDOR such that all those incidents are flushed out? Now, my industry, we're way beyond stopping deaths or stopping serious injuries. We're into near-miss reporting. These are things which have gone wrong, didn't result in any harm or any adverse, but could have done. They had the potential to do it. So there's a pyramid of you start with death and then you go into serious injury and then minor injury, and we're driving down into the bottom of the pyramid. And we've got to get that culture, we've got to get that or responsibility and ways of working into the NHS, such that people see it is part of their job to look for errors and report errors and then make sure it doesn't happen again. So if we use RIDDOR, slide 2, my second proposal was about creating a new organisation within government who has the responsibility to collect this information, to investigate incidents, and make sure that effective action has been taken. Well, if we use RIDDOR, the Health and Safety Executive automatically is that organisation. It's already existing. It does it across the UK, as a matter of fact, anyway. So it's just an extension of existing responsibilities. But there is this new body being formed later this year called the Health Services Safety Investigation Body. And it's been formed out of that Healthcare Safety Investigation branch, which Jeremy Hunt gave the quote to. Now, they've reported about 22, issued about 22 reports so far between 2017 and 2022, and they've looked at probably 100. It's important to recognise that they're probably a useful adjunct to actually investigating things, but they'll do it on a higher level, a grouped level. The real responsibility to investigate is actually at grassroots level, where the incident happens. So if you have the combination of the Health and Safety Executive collecting and driving for this information, you have this new HSSIB body as an extra internal health service expertise to recognise there are systemic problems or group problems or wider problems which perhaps might be better dealt with as a group. But fundamentally, you need to get right down to the ground floor in the organisation, the individual teams in the hospital where these things are happening right now, be it the surgical teams or in the intervention teams or in the wards. So getting their involvement and engagement will be key. I'm not proposing how you do that, but it's absolutely fundamental to making this work. So that's my first two recommendations, which is really trying to drive out and try and stop things going wrong. Avoidable errors, preventable errors. You know, because when they say errors, it's actually meaning harm to the likes of you and me. My final proposal is actually a bit more personal, which is really having an effective joined-up way of monitoring people who've suffered from Hep C. So my experience was that I got diagnosed and put on the shelf for a couple of years. I got the treatment. I had 3 negative PCRs, and I was discharged from the regional liver unit. No interest. My GP didn't pick me up as being anything special. I just came back as a patient. The local hospital didn't pick me up. So I've been in like limbo land since 2002, 20 years. And yet, there's a whole series of potentially serious health problems that I am experiencing and might get worse. And there's no overview of monitoring me, making sure that I'm on track. So my proposal would be is if you get diagnosed with Hep C, there is some system that captures all individuals and monitors them regularly against best practice for both health monitoring and early intervention of potential consequences. So, you know, my experience is that I have to get to hospital admission stage before anybody actually reacts. And I don't think that's right. You know, it's predictable that I've got a whole series of things are wrong with me. If I'm having Hep C, that will result in complications and will result in me getting ill regularly. And yet, I always feel that I have to fight my GP even to get antibiotics. Yeah. Twice, I've self-referred myself to hospitals. The first time was in 2015 when I'd had sepsis, biliary sepsis, and the consultants in the hospital told me I had cirrhosis. Now that was a surprise to me. I knew I had fibrosis, but I didn't know I had cirrhosis. But that was it. Nothing else happened. When I questioned the hospital, not interested. The doctor, not interested. So I got in touch with the regional liver unit, and I contacted the head of the unit, described what was going on, and asked if they'd see me. The answer is, well, if you get referred by your GP, yeah, we're happy to see you. My GP was not at all happy to refer me. Not at all. So, you know, I had to sort of lean on them. Now, it turned out that their diagnosis was that I still was in fibrosis stage. I hadn't got to cirrhosis, which was a great relief. But I shouldn't have to fight to get that. That should be something which just is a routine consequence of dealing with my condition. The second time I referred myself to it was, you know, every year I get infections. You know. Sometimes they're just debilitating, sometimes they're really serious and they get hospitalised. It really detracts from the quality of life, and it can be quite worrying. I wanted to know why. Why was I getting these infections? And I couldn't get a sensible answer out of the GPs. The GP would not refer me to any higher authority. So again, I got in touch with the consultant in Newcastle, so the consultant immunologist, described what was happening and got the same, yeah, of course we'll see you, just get a GP to refer you. The response of the GP was, you can't do that. We're trying to reduce referrals. I'll have to refer this to committee. So, don't know what committee, and don't. But eventually I got there, and it turned out that in your base immune system, there's basically 4 proteins. And in my case, 2 of those proteins are at very, very, very low levels. One of them, called the C-reactive protein, is actually if you go to the doctors with an infection, they take a blood sample, what they're doing is taking a sample to measure the CRP level. What I was told by the immunologist was that my CRP level naturally was so low, even if it went up 100-fold, it would still be below the level which a GP would recognise as having an infection. And he recognised that, in fact, in my case, I should have antibiotics on a more routine basis. Now, I got that letter, my GP got that letter. Shortly after that, I got this ESBL infection, and the same GP who had received the letter came to see me at home and wouldn't prescribe me antibiotics. When I mentioned this letter, she said, "Oh, that's not for us. That's for the hospital." So it's not joined up. And so this is really they're saying is, can we please have a joined up health approach to people who've had Hep C? Now, I'm talking from personal experience here. I don't know what the experience of everybody else is. So some people really might have had a wonderful time, but I'm guessing that there's quite a few people like me out there. So just having a standardised approach to doing it would actually really help. And it would certainly make me feel a lot better, less at risk. So this is my 3 recommendations to the inquiry. I hope that it fits in with the type of thinking that you've already seen. I believe that it would be conclusions which might actually support the wider output from the inquiry. Of course, you have any questions, any queries, please ask. I'm more than happy to add and embellish on this. So, closing, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today, and I wish everybody here the very best, and good luck to us all.
Well, that says it all, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, I won't ask you, as I normally ask Miss Richards, but she's here, so I'll ask her. Who are we seeing tomorrow?
Sorry, Andrew, might I just... so tomorrow, sir, we have closing submissions by Ms Gray on behalf of the Department of Health and Social Care, and no doubt we'll wait and see whether Mr Snowden's questions receive any form of response. And then we have a closing statement by Barbara Scott, who, like Andrew, is an unrepresented core participant.
Good. Thank you very much. And can I... I think that probably was in part for you, but mainly for those who've given us presentations today.
I think so too.
Until tomorrow at 10 o'clock.